Hello and welcome back to Killer Bites, your favorite show on the internet where we cover some of the worst true crime cases of all time. Today I'll be telling you about Dellen Millard, an incredibly privileged white boy, and his friend Mark Smich, a wannabe rapper. On August 30th, 1985, Dellen Millard was born in Toronto, Ontario, Canada to parents Wayne Millard and Madeline Burns. Wayne had been a pilot with Air Canada, and Madeline met Wayne while she was a flight stewardess. Wayne's father, Carl, started his own airline business for transporting cargo in the 1960s called Millard Air. While Dellen's home life seemed picture perfect, school was a different story. Dellen was a very insecure child and was teased for his looks and weight. The kids at school gave him the nickname Dellen the Millin to taunt him. The only thing he could do to get back at the bullies was to bribe them with his money to show off how much better he was. Eventually, Dellen moved out of his dad's house and rented an apartment for himself and his little gang of high school followers. One of the members of Dellen's group was a guy called Mark Smich. Mark Smich was only a couple of years younger than Dellen. Mark was always involved with the police and got into trouble a lot, and he had a very extensive criminal record for driving offenses, failure to appear in court, and things of that nature. In 2006, Mark and Dellen met for the first time. It's said that Dellen didn't take to Mark right away, but as time went on, and because Mark was always around at Dellen's parties, the two became friends. Dellen and Mark gathered a small group to go on missions throughout the area. They would steal Bobcat construction equipment, cars, boats, virtually anything they wanted. Now, during this time, Dellen entered into a relationship with a woman named Christina. One defining factor of Christina was that she hated one of Dellen's previous girlfriends named Laura Babcock. On Laura's birthday, Christina sent her a taunting text message saying, "Happy birthday. A year ago today, I with Dellen." Laura responded to her crude message and said, "Well, that's fine. With him a couple of weeks ago." Christina was livid at this text message she received, no matter if it was her own fault or not, and demanded that Dellen and Laura stop their friendship immediately. Dellen sent a text to Laura in April of 2012 which stated, "You're harmful to me. Please don't try to contact me until you've made some huge leaps in self-discovery." So after sending that text message to Laura, Dellen reached out to Christina to discuss the situation. In his text he stated, "First, I am going to hurt her. Then I will make her leave. I will remove her from our lives." Simultaneously, Dellen instructed an employee at the airplane hangar to make a homemade incinerator out of oil drums. In the end, he ordered an industrial-strength incinerator and a .32 caliber firearm. The incinerator weighed over 10,000 pounds and was called the Eliminator. In July of 2012, Dellen and Laura met up at Dellen's house based on her cell phone's data. Once they arrived, Laura never used her phone again. Shortly after meeting up, Dellen texted Mark and said, "I'm on a mission, be back in 1 hour." On July 2nd, a photo was saved to Dellen's phone that showed a body wrapped in a blue tarp next to the family dog. Later that month, search history shows Dellen had looked up what's the air temperature needed for cremation. Shortly after, another photo was taken, this time of Mark holding an incinerator rake. Laura was reported missing on July 3rd by a close friend and an ex-boyfriend of hers named Sean. Laura had been known to struggle with her mental health and self-harm. She had been homeless a few times and actually took up work as an to get money. Well, despite being broken up, the two were very close, and Sean did everything in his power to support Laura through her difficult times. When Sean reached out to the police, they didn't look further into it. Once they heard she was struggling with mental health and worked as an they refused to look further into her disappearance. To make matters worse, Mark stole Laura's iPad and used it to film himself rapping a song discussing the murder of Laura. The started off all skin and bone. Now the lay on some ash and stone. Last time I saw her, it was outside her home. And if you go swimming, you can find her phone. In November 2012, Dellen's father, Wayne, took his own life. He was found in his home with a bullet wound to the head. Wayne had just finished building a $3 million hangar to be used for plane repair. Dellen hated that his father was using his inheritance money for business expansion and tried everything to stop him. No further investigation into Wayne's death was done, and the police ultimately ruled it a self-inflicted act. After his father's passing, Dellen let his family legacy crash and burn. He stopped any potential business ventures that his father had started and fired everyone from the company. He turned the hangar into a place where he could hide all of his stolen goods from his missions. In 2013, a man named Tim Bosma posted an ad to sell his pickup truck. Tim was a 32-year-old father and construction worker from a small Canadian town called Ancaster. Dellen and Mark saw the ad and used it as their next target. The two contacted Tim from a burner phone under a fake name, explaining that they were interested in the vehicle, but wanted to take it out for a test drive before deciding on anything. Dellen and Mark arrived on foot at Tim's house, which Tim's wife found very odd. But they needed to sell the truck for cash, so they let their worries fall to the side. Tim got into the truck with Dellen and Mark and left for the test drive. What angers me is Dellen clearly had plenty of money to go out and buy a truck, but instead he wanted the adrenaline rush of robbery. He didn't care who he hurt in the process. Well, a couple of hours had passed and Tim's wife couldn't get a hold of him. The phone kept going straight to voicemail and he had not returned home. Tim's wife immediately called the police and reported her husband missing. Now, it's unclear who carried out the homicide, but Tim was shot inside the truck after a disagreement. Dellen and Mark brought Tim back to the hangar and put his body into the incinerator. The very next day, the police started their search and treated it like a missing person investigation with unusual circumstances. They brought out a canine unit to Tim's home to conduct a search. They also realized that the phone used to contact him was a burner that had been used in a few other potential test drives in the days leading up to Tim's disappearance. The men from the second test drive matched the same descriptions for Dellen and Mark. On top of that, Dellen had a very distinct tattoo located on his wrist that said ambition, which was used to identify him. After a few days of surveillance, Dellen was arrested on May 11th in the air hangar. When he was taken into custody, the keys to Tim's truck were found in his pocket. On May 12th, Tim's pickup truck was found discovered inside a trailer registered to Millard Air in Dillen's mother's driveway. Inside the vehicle, investigators found a shell casing, gunshot residue, and small traces of blood. At the air hangar, the Eliminator was found with charred remains believed to be Tim. When closed caption TV footage was looked at, they could see sparks and flames coming from the hangar, only further proving that Dellen and Mark had killed Tim and disposed of his body. After another week of surveillance, Mark was finally arrested. During the trial, the two best friends immediately turned their backs on each other, blaming the other for actually pulling the trigger to end Tim's life. Mark explained that he was in a completely different vehicle from Dellen and Tim, following closely behind. Dillen's legal team fought back and explained that they were all in the car. Dellen drove, Tim sat in the passenger seat, and Mark sat in the back. They argued that Mark pulled out the firearm and threatened Tim in an attempt to steal the car. A struggle ensued, and Tim was accidentally shot. The court couldn't narrow down who pulled the trigger, but they argued that both participated in the robbery's planning and execution and could be charged with first-degree murder anyway. So, on June 17, 2016, Dellen Millard and Mark Smich were convicted of first-degree murder in Tim Bosma's demise and were both sentenced to life in prison. They would not be eligible for parole until after 25 years of their sentencing. Well, our story does not end there, folks. In December of 2017, Laura Babcock's murder was looked into further. While her remains were never recovered, the two men were held accountable and convicted of her murder as well. Dellen and Mark were once again sentenced to life in prison, with the parole ineligibility period of 25 years to be served consecutively with that of the previous sentence, meaning they are to serve a minimum of 50 years and will not be released prior to 2063. Oh, but it doesn't stop there either. After multiple trials for Tim and Laura's slayings, the legal system's eyes were open to one more potential victim: Wayne Millard. The police discovered that the father and son had major disagreements on the family business, including the threat of cutting Dellen off financially. Dillen's legal team argued that the court had proven no legal motive. However, it was later discovered that Dellen had purchased the weapon used to take his father's life, and his cell phone data showed that he was at his father's house at 1 o'clock in the morning and didn't leave until 6 o'clock a.m. On September 24, 2018, Dellen Millard was found guilty and convicted of first-degree murder in the death of his father, Wayne Millard. Dellen pulled the trigger on his father through the eye while he slept and staged the scene to make it look like a suicide. 2 months later, Dellen was sentenced to life in prison for the third time. He would need to serve a total of 75 years before he'd be eligible for parole, which in this case, he would be 103 years old in the year 2088. So basically, Dellen will never be outside his prison cell ever again. This case just goes to show you that money cannot buy happiness, and in the most extreme cases, can ruin countless lives. I'm Jason, and thanks for joining me here on another episode of Killer Bites. We have tons of other videos for you to watch, and I hope to see you back next time. Stay safe.